What if I told you that for nearly a decade, one of the most trusted brands on the planet turned millions of everyday families into unwitting accomplices in a massive, deadly cover-up? They called it clean diesel. It was marketed as the ultimate environmental compromise, a way to save the planet without sacrificing performance. But beneath the hood of 11 million vehicles was a highly classified piece of software, a line of code specifically designed to lie to the United States government, cheat European regulators, and poison the air we breathe. When the truth finally came out, it triggered the largest auto scandal in human history. We are talking about billions in fines, international arrest warrants, and a devastating human toll of over 124,000 premature deaths in Europe alone. By all laws of corporate physics, Volkswagen should have been erased from existence. Instead, they executed a $100 billion pivot and are still one of the largest automakers in the world today. How exactly did a company engineer a global deception, get caught red-handed, and somehow survive to tell the tale? Let us find out. In 2007, Toyota was winning a war Volkswagen had not taken seriously enough. The Prius was everywhere. It was the car that made environmental responsibility look aspirational, and American consumers were buying it by the millions. Volkswagen, the German engineering institution with a century of precision behind its name, was watching its American ambition stall while a Japanese rival redefined what a car was supposed to represent. The boardroom had an answer. They called it clean diesel. The pitch was elegant. Diesel engines are more fuel efficient than petrol, they produce stronger torque, and with the right engineering, they could run clean enough to outflank any hybrid on the market. The marketing teams were excited. The engineers were not. Diesel combustion works differently from petrol. The process produces nitrogen oxide, or NOx, a gas that corrodes lung tissue and contributes directly to urban smog. Under US Environmental Protection Agency rules, the NOx limit for passenger vehicles was strict and fixed. Diesel engines, by their chemical nature, emit up to 20 times more NOx than petrol engines. To bring those figures into legal compliance, you needed expensive exhaust treatment systems that added weight, cut performance, and eroded the very fuel efficiency that made diesel worth building in the first place. VW's engineers ran the numbers, then they ran them again. The car that the boardroom was promising, the one that would conquer America and answer the Prius, was physically impossible to produce within the law. The math did not work, the timeline did not flex, and the pressure from above did not stop. That is where the decision was made, and it was not the one they should have made. When the engineering department reported back, the answer should have been straightforward. We cannot build this car and meet US emissions limits simultaneously, so we either change the car or we accept that we are not entering this market. Volkswagen chose a third option that nobody was supposed to find out about. Inside the engine control unit fitted to every new VW diesel, engineers embedded a piece of software now universally known as the defeat device. It was not some elaborate invention. It was a short block of code that monitored specific real-time inputs: steering wheel angle, vehicle speed, engine load, barometric pressure, and the precise duration of the test sequence itself. On paper, those inputs described the driving environment. In practice, they told the car something far more specific. When those sensor readings matched the exact pattern of an official laboratory emissions test, the car's software activated a separate engine calibration. The exhaust after-treatment system ran at maximum capacity. The engine tuned itself for compliance. The numbers came out clean. Then the test ended. The driver pulled back onto the road, and the software switched quietly back to its standard mode. Performance returned, fuel economy returned, and with them, the pollution returned too. In real-world driving, these cars were emitting NOx at up to 40 times the legal US limit. 40 times. That is not a measurement error. That is a product design decision. If this story already has your attention, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. There are 9 chapters here, and what happens next is where it stops being a business scandal and starts being something far more serious. The fraud would have continued indefinitely if detection had depended on the same government agencies that had been given and accepted every reassurance VW offered. Instead, it was exposed by a team of researchers at West Virginia University who were not even looking for fraud. In 2012, the International Council on Clean Transportation commissioned a modest study. The goal was almost optimistic: demonstrate that European diesel technology could meet US emission standards and use that data to push for tougher rules back in Europe. They hired the WVU Centre for Alternative Fuels, Engines and Emissions for the job. Small team, limited budget, equipment that fits in the boot of a car. That is exactly where they put it. The researchers bolted portable emissions measurement systems into a VW Jetta and a VW Passat, and they drove. Up the Pacific Coast Highway, through city traffic, across freeways and mountain routes. The kind of varied, unpredictable conditions that no controlled laboratory could reproduce, because no controlled laboratory was ever meant to. The data started arriving, and the researchers assumed their sensors were broken. The NOx readings were not moderately elevated. They were not a few percentage points above the acceptable range. They were so far beyond normal that the first explanation anyone reached for was calibration failure. The team recalibrated. They checked every sensor. They ran the cars again. The numbers did not change. They wrote up their findings and passed them to regulators. The equipment was not broken. The cars were performing exactly as they had been designed to perform when no one official was watching. The West Virginia findings reached the California Air Resources Board and the EPA in May 2014. For the next 16 months, Volkswagen denied everything. They offered technical explanations. They attributed the discrepancies to calibration differences between lab conditions and real roads. They committed to software updates that would resolve the irregularities. The agencies accepted those responses, extended their deadlines, and waited. In September 2015, the EPA stopped waiting. On the 18th of September, the agency issued a formal notice of violation to Volkswagen. The language was precise, and the implications were enormous. Volkswagen had installed a defeat device. The company had been in continuous violation of the Clean Air Act for years, and the software was not embedded in a prototype or a limited test batch. It was running inside 482,000 vehicles sold across the United States. That figure would later be corrected. The real number was 11 million cars worldwide. The financial response was immediate. Volkswagen's share price dropped more than 30% across 2 trading sessions, erasing roughly €25 billion in market value in under 48 hours. CEO Martin Winterkorn issued a public statement expressing his personal distress at the situation, and resigned within the week. The company that had just claimed the position of the world's largest automaker by sales volume was now the most visible corporate fraud case on the planet. The financial press covered the stock collapse. The business press covered the resignation. Neither of those stories was the one that mattered most. The real question was not what this had cost the shareholders. It was what it had done to the people breathing the air outside those 11 million cars for the better part of a decade. Nitrogen oxide is not a background nuisance. When it enters the atmosphere in volume, it reacts with sunlight and other chemicals to form ground-level ozone and fine particulate matter. Long-term exposure contributes to chronic lung disease, cardiovascular deterioration, and early death. Children are the most vulnerable group. Their lungs are still forming, and repeated exposure to elevated NOx concentrations increases the probability of lifelong respiratory conditions, including asthma. In May 2025, the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air published a report commissioned by the environmental law organisation Client Earth. The report attempted to calculate the specific health damage attributable to Dieselgate emissions across the EU and UK between 2009 and 2024. The findings were severe. The illegally elevated emissions from the affected vehicles were linked to an estimated 124,000 premature deaths across those 15 years. In the same period, approximately 98,000 new cases of childhood asthma were associated with the excess pollution. The total economic burden of that damage was calculated at €760 billion. To hold that figure against the legal settlements, Volkswagen paid roughly $14.7 billion to resolve US civil claims. The estimated human cost in Europe and the UK alone was more than 50 times that figure in economic terms. And no fine has been structured around that calculation. This is what separates Dieselgate from a standard corporate compliance failure. People developed chronic conditions. People died years before they should have. The decisions that produced those outcomes were made in boardrooms by executives who had been told, in clear technical language, that the car being sold to the public could not legally do what it was advertised to do. The US Department of Justice was not in the business of accepting apologies. In January 2017, Volkswagen entered a guilty plea on 3 criminal counts: conspiracy to defraud the United States government, violation of the Clean Air Act, and obstruction of justice. The accompanying criminal fine was $4.3 billion, one of the largest penalties ever levied against a car manufacturer in American history. That came on top of a $14.7 billion civil settlement agreed in 2016 covering vehicle buybacks for affected US owners, direct consumer compensation, and contributions to environmental remediation funds. For a period, the desert lots of the American Southwest became the most visible evidence of the scale of what had been done. Tens of thousands of repurchased VW and Audi diesel vehicles were lined up in rows across storage facilities in California, Nevada, and Arizona. Cars that could not legally be resold in the country where they had been marketed, each one a fixed point in an enormous ledger of manufactured dishonesty, waiting to be crushed or shipped back to Europe. In Germany, the legal timeline moved at a different pace. Oliver Schmidt, who had overseen VW's US regulatory compliance program and was one of the few senior figures who travelled to the United States after the scandal broke, was arrested by American authorities and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. His case was the exception. The senior executives who sat above the defeat device program remained in Germany, where American extradition requests produced almost nothing. The engineers who wrote the code, the managers who ran the compliance teams, they were the ones who answered to American courts, and the company, somehow, kept producing cars. The question of personal accountability is the part of this story that the press cycle moved through fastest, possibly because the answer was not satisfying. Martin Winterkorn, the CEO who had led Volkswagen through its period of peak fraud and resigned days after the EPA notice, was indicted by US federal prosecutors in 2018 on charges of fraud and conspiracy. He has never appeared in an American court. Germany does not extradite its own nationals. As of 2026, Winterkorn remains in Germany, where domestic proceedings have continued through years of procedural delay. A German court confirmed in early 2024 that he was medically fit to stand trial. The case remained ongoing. The structural reality is this. In the American justice system, the people with the deepest operational proximity to the fraud face the most immediate and severe consequences. Oliver Schmidt served 7 years in federal prison. A small number of other mid-level figures faced criminal charges in the US and Europe. The engineers and technical managers who sat closest to the defeat device code were the ones who answered to judges and juries. The executives who created the commercial conditions that made building an illegal product feel like the rational response to boardroom pressure, the ones who signed off on the market strategy, who approved the targets, who received the reports. They largely continued their lives in Germany, within a legal framework that was not designed to reach them. Volkswagen as an institution drew a line under the leadership era, restructured its governance, appointed new executives, and announced that the company would now be defined by what it built next. It was a narrative that required a very large investment to make believable, and they made it. The pivot was announced with the speed and volume of a company that needed the world to look somewhere other than where it had just been looking. In 2017, Volkswagen committed more than €34 billion to electrification, autonomous systems, and digital infrastructure over the following 5 years. The ID series, a family of purpose-built electric vehicles on a new modular platform, became the physical expression of that commitment. It was part engineering ambition, part corporate penance, and part an extraordinarily expensive attempt to replace one brand association with another. The transition was not frictionless. Early ID3 production was held back for months by software issues serious enough to require significant rework before cars could be delivered to customers. Margins on electric vehicles compressed industry-wide as raw material costs rose and competition intensified. The European market for EVs showed signs of demand plateauing as consumers ran into charging infrastructure gaps. VW's cost base, built around internal combustion manufacturing developed over more than a century, was not engineered for an overnight reorientation, but the output was real. By 2025, Volkswagen Group had delivered close to 1 million battery electric vehicles globally. In Europe, the group captured a 27% share of the battery electric vehicle market. The ID.4, the ID.7, and the EV lines under Audi, Porsche, and Skoda were all generating sales. VW was appearing in conversations about the future of transport, not only in retrospectives about the largest emissions fraud in industrial history. They had done what no one genuinely expected them to do. They had stayed relevant. The question now was whether relevance and accountability were the same thing, because the 2026 numbers answered that directly. In the first quarter of 2026, Volkswagen Group reported sales revenue of €75.7 billion. The company delivered approximately 200,000 battery electric vehicles in that quarter alone, while holding a 10% share of global passenger car sales in what VW's own reporting described as a declining overall market. By every standard financial measure, Volkswagen did not just survive Dieselgate, it remains one of the largest automotive groups on Earth. But the emissions chapter is still open. Reporting from Motor One in May 2026 confirmed that VW Group faces potential fines of up to €500 million per year across the 2025 to 2027 period for missing new EU fleet-wide CO2 targets. Total exposure, up to €1.5 billion, roughly $1.7 billion, for failing to meet the stricter standards that were themselves partly a downstream consequence of the original scandal. A decade after the EPA notice, Volkswagen is still at risk of being penalised for emissions. A different kind, a different regulation, the same fundamental problem. Here is what the full ledger actually shows. VW paid $4.3 billion in criminal fines. They settled for $14.7 billion in the US. They spent billions more on legal defense, consumer compensation, and the electric pivot. And they are still generating €75 billion in a single quarter. The fines were historically large in absolute terms. Against the machine that absorbed them, they were a manageable expense. They did not get away with it without cost. But they got away with it. And if you want to understand how power actually operates inside the global economy, that single conclusion might be the most important sentence in this entire video. If this story changed how you see corporate accountability, share it with someone who should understand what that word actually means in practice. And subscribe, because this channel exists to explain how the world actually runs.